Welcome to this episode of the Sports Detective Podcast Show. My name is James Williams, and today we discuss the Milwaukee Bucks firing Adrian Griffin after a 30-13 start to the season and hiring ESPN TV analyst and former head coach of the Philadelphia 76ers, the Los Angeles Clippers, and the Boston Celtics. Doc Rivers is set to be the Milwaukee Bucks' new head coach. Before I will talk about the Doc Rivers hiring and kind of my reaction to that towards the end of this video. But first, I want to talk about Adrian Griffin getting fired and why he got fired. And I'll show you kind of a clip that Chris Haynes was talking about last night on NBA on TNT in a little bit. But first, a lot of people are very shocked by this firing. And if you haven't necessarily been following all of the stories throughout the season with the Milwaukee Bucks, you might be kind of shocked by this because you look at the record in the East. They're one of the best teams record-wise in the NBA. And it's kind of like, well, wait a second. They're 30-13. They're still a contender in the conference. Like, why make this move on a first-year head coach that's still kind of learning to be a head coach? Like, what the heck is happening here? Well, guys, the reason he got fired is because he's lost the locker room, and I think he lost the locker room a long time ago. And this has been a very, very weird and bumpy ride for the Bucks over this first 4 months, even though they have been winning. So let's just kind of go over some of those stories and kind of things that we were seeing kind of bubble under the surface, but it finally all erupted and it came to like a tipping point yesterday where the Bucks finally decided to move on. So the preseason finale of the Bucks season, the Bucks had a assistant coach, Terry Stotts, excuse me, who was the longtime, Blazers head coach during the Damian Lillard run. And he was brought in, hey, he's got a good relationship with Damian Lillard. He's got, former head coaching experience. He'll be kind of able to help Adrian Griffin, develop as a head coach. Well, there was some sort of disagreement, at a shoot around or a practice. And, Griffin and Stotts got into it. And there was some sort of like, not altercation, but some sort of like argument, disagreement. And eventually Stotts was just like, all right, screw this, man. Like, I'm not going to deal with this stuff. I'm in my 60s. I've made enough money. Like, I'm not going to deal with this crap. So he ends up leaving. So that's the first kind of like red flag where we're kind of like, what the heck is happening here with Adrian Griffin? Like, what the heck is happening? This is a very, very, we don't see that often. We don't see, assistant coaches just like, quit before the season's even started. So that was incident number one. End of the fast forward to the NC. Excuse me. Actually, before that, a few games into the season. So Adrian Griffin comes from that Nick Nurse, Raptors coaching tree, where the Raptors had a lot of like kind of versatile defenders, where they could switch a lot of that stuff, and they were more kind of on the tack, attack defense is what people like to call it. And basically, Adrian Griffin was like, "Oh, this worked out really well in Toronto. We're going to implement this stuff here in Milwaukee." Well, a few games in, the Milwaukee Bucks were just getting absolutely torched on defense, with this, setup here. And basically, a lot of the veteran players went to Adrian Griffin and was like, hey, like this scheme's not working. We need to go back to what we were doing the last 2 years under Coach Bud, where we were one of the top defenses in the NBA. Now, part of the reason I think they are less of a defensive team this year than they were last year is because basically their backcourt is Damian Lillard, who is not a good defender. And then it's basically just kind of like a bunch of like, they've been kind of patching it together, with glue and duct tape at that other, guard position. So I think that they just don't have necessarily the front court defense that they did with Drew Holiday and Grayson Allen over the last few years. But with that being said, though, when you don't have that good front court defense, or excuse me, backcourt defense like you did the last few years, having that kind of aggressive attack defense doesn't necessarily work. So it's part of the reason that the Bucks were just getting absolutely torched. They've been a below average defense all year. Fast forward to the in-season tournament. Bobby Portis basically comes out with some quotes that is basically like, hey, like we don't know what we're running at the end of games. We need better communication on that. We don't know what kind of scheme we're running. We're not sure what we're trying to run at the end of games. We don't know who we're running the ball, running our offense through. Like we're very lost on that right now. So that's another thing where we're like, oh, okay, that's, a little bit of a red flag. Why is a player a month and a half into the season coming out and basically criticizing like the offensive scheme? Fast forward to early January. The Giannis goes on a rant at the end of or after a game. It's like a 7.5 minute rant, and I'll just read you a short little kind of snippet. It's a loss to the Rockets, and this is a little bit of a snippet from that rant that Giannis went on. This is also the rant too, I believe, where Giannis was talking about like, hey, everyone needs to be better. He's like the people that wash our clothes need to be better. But basically, he's kind of like saying all that stuff. It's like, hey, our coach needs to do a better job of implementing a scheme, an offensive system, a defensive system, and because we're not getting it, and we don't feel like he's doing a good job implementing that and communicating that to us. So this is this Giannis quote here. What is our strategy? Are we going to give up a lot of open threes? Are we going to let them get in the paint? When they go in the post, are we going to stay with ours and play one-on-one? What is our strategy? Right now, we are giving everything. We are giving everything. We are giving the threes. We are giving the straight line drives. We are letting guys play in the post and get comfortable. We're giving offensive rebounds. Basically, it's like, hey, our defense is an absolute mess, and we don't know what we need to do to fix it. And we are getting mixed signals, or at least no signals from our head coach on how to address this stuff and correct this stuff. So that's another kind of like red flag there. And again, I'll get to that Chris Haynes thing here in a little bit, where he talks about, how the front office, basically ended up making this decision. One more point here, though. Last week, January 17th, the Bucks are playing the Cleveland Cavaliers. Giannis is out. The Bucks got absolutely drubbed in that game. They lost by 40 points. They started out that game losing that game 22-2. That's how the game started. The Cleveland Cavaliers were up 22-2. Again, Bucks, when they don't have their best player, obviously aren't going to be as good as they are with their best player. But 22-2 to start the game is absolutely pathetic. And again, you could say, well, it's the players, they own some culpability for that too. They own some blame for that too. But to me, that's just like the players just are completely out on Adrian Griffin. He has lost the locker room at this point. Now, I'm going to go ahead and play this clip here from Chris Haynes, who basically talked about this on TNT last night, of how the Bucks were ultimately able to get this decision of firing Adrian Griffin. And he talks kind of a little bit of the front office perspective.
This was a shock to many of us. Why did they make this change now?
Adam, it's funny you phrase it that way, because if you talk to members of the Bucks, well, if they will be honest with you, it wasn't a shock to them. And the reason why I say that is the last week and a half or so, the front office began attending the practices and shoot-arounds. And why that isn't uncommon, usually with front office members, they will look at practice from afar, usually from their office. But I was told over the last week and a half, General Manager John Horst and Assistant General Manager Milt Newton, they were actually on the floor, on the sidelines, observing practice. That started to raise eyebrows amongst members of the Bucks and the coaching staff. And we've all throughout this season, we've all been hearing about rumbles of guys being unhappy, roles, schemes not being well executed and formulated. And even me, I reported back in December during the in-season tournament when Bobby Portis called out Coach Adrian Griffin about the schemes and their lack of execution down the stretch. And so there's been signals all throughout this 4-month tenure of Adrian Griffin as the head coach of the Milwaukee Bucks, which led to this point. Now, I will say this. I want to kind of clarify, because I know people will say, well, why are they firing Adrian Griffin now? Because, they hired him in June. And at that point, that was before Damian Lillard. And they were still a championship contending team at that point before Damian Lillard. But the way it was explained to me was that the Bucks going into the summer, they faced the unknown. They didn't know if they were going to be able to resign Chris Middleton. They didn't know if they were going to resign Brook Lopez, Giannis Antetokounmpo. They didn't know if he was going to do an extension. So they kind of braced themselves to kind of take a step back. They didn't know if they were going to be able to be this potent going into this season. Then the trade happens. They acquire Damian Lillard. Now expectations change, and that made life a little bit more harder for Adrian Griffin. So there's a lot of things that happen behind the scenes, and you can make the argument that he probably wasn't ready for this type of a situation. But again, this wasn't the situation that he originally signed up for.
All right, so there you have it, guys. I think that was a very interesting point there at the beginning. But before I get into that part at the end where he's like, well, Adrian Griffin the Bucks are trying to take a step back. I actually don't believe that, because like Giannis and Chris Middleton were in the coaching interviews. They had a very much a big say in who their coach was going to be. And that's why they ultimately picked Adrian Griffin. Again, Adrian Griffin did kind of have the struggles with losing Drew Holiday, and then they've been kind of, like we said, have kind of been struggling with that backcourt defense, just talent-wise. So I think that's part of it. But again, too, he still was not able to get his message across to the players effectively enough. And again, this was a hard job. But again, to that part at the beginning, basically the front office goes down to the practices because they're seeing all of this stuff bubble up. They've probably had players go to them and be like, hey, this isn't working. Like, this isn't working. So they're like, all right, let's go ahead and see this stuff for ourselves. So they've been seeing practices and they've been like, oh yeah, he's lost the locker room and the team is not buying into anything that he's saying. And they're basically just zoning him out. So that's ultimately why they decided to go on to that decision. Now, to the hiring of Doc Rivers, which all of this stuff, it all just got finalized this morning. But we were hearing all of that stuff kind of he talked about, towards the, the late hours of a Tuesday night when all of this news was breaking. As we know, the Bucks wanted a, head coach with coaching experience who, had, some, experience dealing with stars and getting stars to cohabitate and play together. And Doc obviously has that, dating back to the Boston Celtics, going to the Clippers with CP and Blake, going to the Clippers with Kawhi and Paul George, going to the Sixers with Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons, then Joel Embiid and James Harden. I actually think with the amount of options that the Bucks had, I think this was maybe their best option. Now, before I get into that stuff here too, there was a story like a few weeks ago that hey, the Lakers are getting frustrated with Darvin Ham. The players are out on him. They're frustrated with their roles. They're frustrated with the inconsistencies of their rotation. The fact that Doc Rivers jumped into this job very much surprises me because I thought he was enjoying, not coaching, being a broadcaster, giving his opinions on stuff. I think he was very much enjoying that. So I was very shocked that he made this move. But a thing that I'm curious about, and again, we won't know, I wonder if the Lakers maybe screwed up with not firing Darvin Ham, because would Doc Rivers have just jumped into that job? Would he have? Or is Doc Rivers only jumping into this Bucks job because he's like, hey, I can come in here and I think I can win a title this year and I want to win another title as a head coach. Would he have jumped into the Lakers job? Obviously, he wouldn't have jumped into the Hornets job. So he wouldn't have jumped into any job, but would he have jumped into the Lakers job? Would he have jumped into, maybe I guess the Lakers would be the only one, but I don't know. Part of me is thinking a little bit hey, did the Lakers screw up not firing Darvin Ham and getting Doc Rivers? Because again, say what you want about Doc Rivers, I think he's an coaching upgrade over Adrian Griffin. I think he's a coaching upgrade, would have been a coaching upgrade over Darvin Ham. He's a top 10 head coach, maybe not a top 5 head coach anymore in the NBA, but top 10 NBA head coach. Getting into the hiring though. So a lot of people kind of I think rightfully, kind of thought about this Doc Rivers hiring. It's the reason Coach Bud got fired from the Bucks was because they were underachieving in the postseason. And they brought in Doc Rivers, who when the Sixers got bounced last year, everyone was bringing up all of the times that Doc Rivers had a lead in a playoff series and ended up losing it. And all the stats came out of the most 3-1, deficits lost as a head coach, the most 3-2 deficits lost as a head coach, I think might have been another stat. And basically it's this guy can't finish off playoff series. Well, I think part of that too is because Doc has just always been on really good teams that make the playoffs. And I think blaming Doc for all of that stuff is, taking some blame away from the players on this stuff too. Because it's what if CP and Blake did, without Doc? What have Kawhi and Paul George done since, Doc left? What did Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons or Joel Embiid and James Harden do before Doc got there? So I think that's taking some culpability away from the players. But again, if you're looking at, this is where I will defend the hire a little bit here too. And even the Bucks, playoff struggles over the last few years. So if you look at, they win the title in 2022, they go 7 games with the Boston Celtics. They were up 3-2 in that series. Chris Middleton was out that entire series. And the Bucks, the best version that we have seen of the Celtics in the Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown era, that was the best version of them. And the Bucks still went to 7 without their second best player, or third best player if you think Holiday was better. If they have Chris Middleton, I think they win that series. I think they beat the Heat in the conference finals. And I think they probably would have been favorites against the Warriors. Not saying they would have won. There's a whole lot of, ripple effects that would have happened from that. but I do think they would have had a very good shot of repeating that year. Last year, the Bucks are the 1 seed in the East, obviously. And Jimmy Butler basically just has like a nuclear explosion on offense in that series. And he just looks like basically like the reincarnation of Michael Jordan, basically, is what Jimmy Butler was in that series. I also want to point out Giannis Antetokounmpo got hurt in that series. I think he either missed 1 or 2 games in that series. And again, if they have a healthy Giannis that entire series, is that completely different? Because I think he kind of got rushed back from that injury too, because like he sat out a game, and it's like, holy crap, the Bucks. They're like, oh crap, if we don't bring Giannis back, we might lose this series, and they ended up losing it anyway. But they also kind of choked away some of those fourth quarters too. The Bucks did. So like it kind of was understandable that they did move on from Coach Bud, but I do think it was more of like, hey, they had some injuries and met some bad injury luck, more so than it was Coach Bud just being completely incompetent as a head coach and the Bucks having some sort of block of succeeding in the postseason. So if you're telling me that the Bucks this year are able to get another trade, because I saw reports today that they're trying to maybe upgrade that second guard position next to Dame. And they're willing to trade Pat Connaughton and campaign. Not sure what kind of player they might get. I think maybe an Alex Caruso would be a good fit. I think a Bruce Brown would be a good fit for them. But we'll kind of see what they do with that position. But I do think, Doc can get the best out of this group. And I think it was a good hire for the circumstances here. So there you have it, guys. Been talking for 17 minutes now, so I think I'll just call it quits on this video. There you have it. Adrian Griffin loses the locker room, gets fired. The Bucks go ahead and hire Doc Rivers. Obviously, none of this stuff happens if Giannis Antetokounmpo doesn't approve of it. Let me know in the comments, guys. Do you think Doc was a good hiring? Do you think this was a the right time to fire Adrian Griffin? Do you think they should have let it play out for the rest of the season? Just kind of let me know what you think in the comments. If you like this video, please hit that like button. If you like this video too, hit that subscribe button. Really help us out in the algorithm. Feel free to explore our channel for more NBA content. So thank you very much for watching. I'll talk to you next time.